All right. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Wow, you're awake. Wonderful. It is early, and it is the last day of Build, so I really appreciate you coming here, spending some time here, the last hour, the last session before the closing keynote. Thank you very much. So I want to tell a story about Visual Studio and how we took it from something that was very popular to something that was maybe the best it has ever been on a bunch of metrics that I'm going to share with you. And hopefully, as part of the lessons that we learned along the way, there's something for you as well. So when you come home to your companies, your organizations, your teams, there will be something that you've picked up here that you might be able to implement on your own. Because Visual Studio is one of the most used and most loved IDEs out there. Yeah, it has its flaws, of course, but nonetheless, it's still one of the most loved pieces of software for developers. But that's not always the case and not always the image we have when we think of Visual Studio. And our story begins with Robert. He tweeted, "Considering programming is my life, I wish I felt my tools wanted to support me." This was a direct tweet toward Visual Studio. And it was one that really hit home because the whole purpose of Visual Studio is to support developers, to make them perform their job in a way that makes them productive and, happy and so on. And so this was something that, for me, was like kind of a strike against, like, why am I working on Visual Studio in the first place if Robert feels this way? Now, this was not the first time we heard sentiments that users were a little bit unhappy with certain things, but this was the time where we're like, okay, enough is enough. What can we do to figure out why do some people have these feelings about our product? And so we kind of just grabbed a bunch of people and said, okay, let's try to get to the bottom of this. And we came out with a few hypotheses, a few questions that came out after interviewing people, looking at feedback, talking to a bunch of our users. And all this thinking amounted in some questions. Are we listening to users? Do we respect them? And are our goals even aligned with theirs? This was not obvious to us what the answer would be to these things. So it was something we wanted to investigate. But this was the crux of it when we synthesized all the information we had, all the feedback. This was kind of the crux of it. So let's start with whether or not we are listening to our users. Well, first of all, when we want to get very highly qualitative data input, we have the User Experience Research Lab. It's in Redmond, it's 10 miles from here. And we invite people in, and we sit them down and give them tasks they have to solve using Visual Studio, and we can monitor their eye movements, we register their clicks, all that type of stuff. So we know exactly how they interact with the product, and it's really, really helpful to learn and understand how users use Visual Studio. We get a lot from that. And we can sit out here on that little table and watch on the monitors as we take people through these different tasks that we ask them to solve. So a fantastic tool for getting feedback from a qualitative perspective. We also do quantitative. We ask you to fill out a survey when you install Visual Studio, when you uninstall Visual Studio, when you're using Visual Studio, and when you're sleeping. I'm going to send you an email asking you to take a survey. So you know about this, right? You can't buy milk in the store anymore without you getting an email asking how to rate that experience with the local corner store or something. So we do this all the time. We get a lot of quantitative feedback. And in the past 15 years of Microsoft, I don't know. I've seen how we've ramped up on doing more and more surveys, and the whole world has, it seems. I don't know if I can say that has that improved our products. I don't know if that's clear to me. I don't know how to measure that. And then we have something where you can come and you can ask for features. We call it the developer community. If you're in Visual Studio and you go to Help, the Help menu, there's a button that says add a feature request, and we get thousands of feature requests. So not only do you tell us through surveys and we take you through qualitative, experimentation and whatnot, you literally tell us directly to our face, I want this feature. And then people vote on it. And so we get all that information too. So the more we know, the better decisions we can make. If that's the theory. But were we just hearing you, or maybe not fully listening? That is the question. What about respect? So you gave us all these feature requests. And I said we have thousands of them. Some of them have thousands of votes, and some of them have fewer. But we don't always implement these. Some of them can be open for years and nothing happens, nothing moves, and you see a bunch of comments coming in. It's like, hey, why are you not doing anything? And so, we have maybe other goals, or there's prioritization issues where we can't do everything, of course. But maybe we just want the product to go in another direction. And so I don't know, do we just know better than you? Like why is this that we have all these unfixed feature requests? So is that respect? I don't know. Maybe not to the extent that we want to claim that we respect users, maybe. Well, what about the goals? So we're always dealing, when we're building product, we're always dealing with, we have our business goals and we have our users' goals, right? Two separate things. So the user wants to be able to do, perform the task that makes them better at their job. And the business wants to sell some product, make some money, right? And so they might want to say, hey, we want you to move to Azure. So we're going to spend a lot of time building features for Azure. And you might be like, well, but I'm actually building desktop apps. So that's not maybe where I'm at right now. And so, what happens sometimes is that our business goal and our user goals become separate. And that's highly problematic because let's say that we do spend a lot of time building a feature that, is designed to make money, let's say, but the user really needs something else and is not interested in that thing that the business is interested in. Then we're now spending money building something that no one is using at an opportunity cost where we could have built something that users actually wanted. And so that's a lose-lose situation where no one wins here. The business doesn't win, and the user doesn't win. So what we always want to do is to align these goals as much as we can such that we get to the win-win situation. And there's been times in our past, definitely, where we didn't have that win-win, and that's not nice. All right. So with these questions in mind, let's take a look at some of the things that we did to kind of build Visual Studio into this more lovable thing. So first up, quality of life improvements. So, Visual Studio is an app that you use all day, every day. Some people spend like 8 to 10 hours a day, which is basically half their waking lives are spent in Visual Studio. So when you think about that, it's a home away from home. People spend so much time there that quality of life really matters. It's kind of like when you're at home, it matters to you whether you have hardwood floor or carpet or what color your walls are, right? Because, it's not something that's going to change what you can do. The scenarios, there's not like new scenarios are unlocked or something like that, but it matters to you. And it's the same thing with Visual Studio. So small paper cuts that, they're not a big deal, but they're a big deal if it's multiple times a day, like per hour, hours on hours, 7 days a week, and so on and so forth. So it turns out that when we go ask you what is that you want Visual Studio to do, very often it's the little things, because the little things become big. So here are some examples of that. So make sure we remove the paper cuts when we can. So we started doing that. So we went through all your feedback, bug reports, all that type of stuff. Okay, where are some paper cuts we can remove like super quick? Let's just get it done. Industry standards, also very important. Like you might have keyboard shortcut muscle memory from VS Code or Word or something else that you want to be able to just use over in Visual Studio. We actually know that there are features people are requesting in Visual Studio that's already there, but they're hitting a keyboard shortcut that does nothing in Visual Studio, and they think, oh, that feature is not there. And so by adopting the industry standards, we can make that much more fluent experience. And much more sensible defaults as well. Let's just set everything up for the smoothest, happy path from the get-go. Again, oftentimes very small tweaks were needed for this. And then we're going to look at delighters. These are the things that does nothing really for your daily job other than put a smile on your face. And we doubled down on that. And after having done this, we started experimenting with a bunch of things. We got overwhelming feedback. And this was feedback that came from like Twitter, from conferences like this, comments on our blog posts and whatnot. People absolutely loved and were able to tell that, hey, something has changed. All of a sudden, you're implementing all the things that I've been wanting for years. And this was unprompted feedback. People just started noticing. So this was such a success by looking at the quality of life stuff that our leadership took notice. And we were able to get this in as our OKRs. So that's kind of our divisional goals. So it is now an official goal of Visual Studio to improve the quality of life, doing the foundational work, making sure that everything, muscle memory, paper cuts, reductions, all this type of stuff is now something we measure and reward as part of our jobs working on the Visual Studio team. I want to say, I forgot to mention when we started, we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions at the end, just walk up here to the microphone. It's in the middle of the aisle here. All right, so that was the quality of life. So next up is the dog fooding and previews that we do. So oftentimes what happens is that when we update Visual Studio, we accidentally break people. And we get a bunch of bug reports saying, hey, you broke, whatever. I can no longer open my solution, or this project no longer builds because I updated to the latest version of Visual Studio. That used to be very common. It still happens today. We really try to not have that happen, right? It's a really important thing. But it does happen. And we don't want to break anyone because we want you to update as frequent as we push out a new version. Because if you don't update, you're not getting the latest productivity features, you're not getting the latest delighters, the latest bug fixes, the latest of everything. And so it can hurt you, but of course it also hurts us because we want you to be on the latest so we can keep you onto the, whatever's the latest and greatest and keep wow you with our fantastic features, right? I think anyone who builds software want users to always be on the latest, and we are no different than that. So it's important that we don't break scenarios. And I don't know if you were part of that crowd, but it used to be common that no one would install Visual Studio like in a big enterprise. The IT admins were like, yeah, we're not going to take any new version of Visual Studio until the first service pack was released. Like that was kind of a common up through the 2000s and whatnot. And we don't want that because that means that you could be like a year behind, 6 months or a year, maybe sometimes longer. And so you're really missing out on a lot of stuff. So we started doing dog fooding. So dog fooding means to eat your own dog food. Now we're a little bit special in that we can build Visual Studio using Visual Studio. I always joke whenever we release a new major version of Visual Studio, when we released Visual Studio 2022, I said, did you know that Visual Studio 2022 was built using Visual Studio 2022? And it's true, it was, because every night we get a new version available to us and we get a little update notification in Visual Studio, we click it and we update to the latest nightly build, and then we continue our work on Visual Studio, using Visual Studio. That's called dog fooding. And we all do this now. It used to be, when we rolled this out, it was actually very hard. Our internal environment was not set up for this. And so we didn't even use proper Visual Studio. We used something called Rascal, which was kind of a weird Franken-build of Visual Studio that wasn't the real thing. And after some years and a lot of work, we're now able to just use the latest nightly, and we get an update notification and we install it. And it's called the internal preview, and we run that, and we've done that for years now. And we started having like these, we gamified it to make sure that all the teams, all engineers and PMs would always use the latest internal build. And so we would send out emails, who's dog fooding, what team are not doing as well as others. And so we were like kind of gamifying it. And now it's like everyone just does it. Like we don't do that anymore, we don't have to. It's now just part of the DNA. We just do it. And of course it's really clever because we are now catching bugs super early in the process. Because we're using it in production, our own production, right? So we can catch it before we even come out into any preview or any public. We have already used it for months internally. So here's how it looks like when we want to release a new update. First, we dog food for as long as it takes. And when we're done with that, we're going to put out into a public preview. How many people here are using the preview version of Visual Studio? Hands up. All right, got like 3 handfuls. So it goes out in the preview. And we have a bunch of people that are using the preview and testing out and making sure everything works. So we get, instead of just our own feedback, we get from people with other solutions, other real world scenarios, and they get to test it out too and tell us if something breaks. And of course we have telemetry we collect, so we know of crashes and hangs and unusual patterns and all that type of stuff so that we can act on it while it's still in preview. Then when we've done that, we're like, okay, we've shipped 6 to 8 previews. Now we're ready for the stable release. What we call GA, general availability. So how do we roll it out? We do what's called a gradual rollout. So once we push the button, and it is kind of a manual thing, we're in a meeting. It used to be, before COVID, we would all sit in a room and we would each push the button that we were responsible for. So someone had to push out the bits to the CDN, push. And then the next person had to say, okay, let's update the installer manifest so that it would show up in the installer worldwide. Okay, push. Okay, let's do the release notes, push. And the blog post, push. So we did it like that. If there was a failure along the way, we wouldn't continue to the next step. So it was a manual thing. It's still like that, but now it's just virtual. But instead of everybody getting an update notification at the same time in Visual Studio saying, oh, there's a new version, we do it gradually. So the first people that gets an update notification are internal users. Whether they're working in Visual Studio or they're working on the Windows team or whatever, they will get the first one. The next one that gets it are people that we know have acquired Visual Studio Pro and Enterprise. Those are the paid version of Visual Studio. They've done so in, let's say, creative ways that are not necessarily legal, right? Pirates, if you will. We're going to test out our new update on them first. So, so they get out, and now we have even more exposure, right? We get even more data of real-world stuff. And if there's any issues, we can make a quick fix and do, push the button again to get a new service release out real quick. And then when we've done that, it goes to the community users, which are free users, and then eventually Pro and Enterprise, which are the paid users. They get it after it's kind of been tested out a little bit by the masses. Now, everyone can go into the installer and says, just give me the latest right now. Everyone can do that. But we don't push out the update notification to everybody. We do that through a gradual rollout. And then we say, okay, now it's out. That's the release. So we go through this very elaborate kind of testing for it to test out all the real world scenarios before it gets into the hands of the users. So this is fantastic in finding issues. And we can tell from our telemetry that our crash and hang rate and all that has basically gone down to 1/3 of what it was just a few years ago. So that is the actual chart. That's what it looks like. I think it's a 2-year period of doubling down and just testing and doing this gradual rollout. So quite a big difference there. Excuse me. The next one. Aligning business and user goals. So those were the circles from before, right? So let's take a real world example. There is an app called SQL Server Management Studio. How many people here use that? SSMS? Whoa, okay. That's half the room. Amazing. It does not look like this. I did this logo to make it look older than it actually is. So that's me doing art. This PowerPoint has a button that says, make this look like something old. Yeah, click that. Because it was. SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS, was built on top of the Visual Studio isolated shell. Visual Studio used to be in the shell business. You could download a version of Visual Studio that was nothing but the shell. It didn't have C# in it, C++ didn't have anything. It had all the menus, it had the tool window layout, and you could put in your own stuff. That was the shell. And up until 2017, we produced that. Every time we produced a new version of Visual Studio, you could get the shell. That's what was SSMS was built on. But we did not make a new one since Visual Studio 2017. That was the last version we did. We decided we're not going to be in the shell business anymore. So all of a sudden, feedback started coming in. Hey, where's dark mode? Where's 64-bit support? You know, all this type of stuff. And the SSMS team, which at the time was like not super invested in SSMS, it's a free tool. They couldn't really justify. They couldn't build those features in because it was built on the Visual Studio shell. It didn't have dark mode at that time. It didn't have 64-bit support. They would have to do a major undertaking to add those things in. And they could no longer be in the Visual Studio shell. And so it's a free tool. How could they had an issue. The users had a goal for it, but the business wasn't there. So how were they able to do something about this? Well, it's really cool, and you might have seen the news already, right? At this build, where the SQL Server Management team were able to release SSMS 21. Was announced this week. It has been in preview since last fall. And SSMS 21 is the first release that is built on the Visual Studio 2022. What's really, really cool, what they were able to do is, I'm absolutely amazed at the team and how they were able to pull this off. They realized that they have been counting their active users wrong this entire time. And it turned out they had millions and millions of users that they just didn't really know. So that was helpful in figuring out, okay, maybe there's something there to look into. And so they did. And they figured out how to do this so that they could produce, so that the business could align, the business goal could align with the user goal, so that they technically were able to create SSMS as a Visual Studio SKU. You have Community, Pro, Enterprise, Test Tools, and SSMS. It is now just a version of Visual Studio, except that's only technically speaking. If you download SSMS, it's SSMS. You wouldn't know that that's what it is. But technically, that is how it's built now. And so we're building it from the same pipelines and everything. It's absolutely amazing that they were able to pull this off. And they did that by aligning the business goal and the user goal. And finally, we're able to give the users all the things that they wanted, like 64-bit, dark theme, extensions are coming, Copilot's coming, to get the Git integration and TFS integration, DevOps, GitHub, all that stuff. All the stuff that people have been asking for years is now finally viable because the team took their time to look into it and didn't stop. They figured out how to align those circles. Otherwise, this would never have happened. And so I'm super proud and I'm very impressed by the team for doing this. I think it's absolutely phenomenal. So if you haven't checked out SSMS 21, go get it. The way that it's built now, it's actually using the same installer as Visual Studio. So you can manage both SSMS and Visual Studio from the same installer. So that means you can manage it the same way. So if you're using Intune or whatever it is for managing group policy and all that, you can now do that for SSMS as well. And of course, the feedback here was absolutely phenomenal. People were up in arms. They've been waiting for so long for new features, and they're just getting started. There's much more to come. Me personally, I'm very excited for the extension work. You can do extensions now, but it's not fully baked in. You have to do some tricks to run extensions, but you can do it. But that will also come in much more smoothly, just like Visual Studio. So if you have an extension you love for Visual Studio, guess what? You'll be able to use that for SSMS as well. Your favorite color themes, all that stuff. All right. And then the fourth thing we did was about internal users. We often forget about internal users. So if any of you are like working on the security side of things, and you'd be like, hey, users, they can't, my users, the developers, they don't have full permissions on their local machines, or they have to do certain things. The user might be like, I need to have local permission to do admin rights and to do my job and all that. There's maybe a little bit of conflict. And so typically what we do is that we tell our users, hey, go do something, and here's a wiki. Just read the wiki on how to do this, right? So number one, no one reads wikis, except for the author and their manager, right? That's a known fact. Second, what a crappy way of treating our customers. We would never do that to our external customers. Be like, hey, I think I found a bug, or I don't know how to do this. Oh, just go read the wiki. No, we would make it super easy for them to do the thing that they needed to do, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't buy our product. But guess what? Internally, we don't really give people an alternative to the IT department, let's say, right? So they have to do that. And so that's the same for us, for every company. So how can we expect our internal teams to treat our external users with respect, fully listening, quality of life kind of things, if we don't do it internally, if it's not part of who we are, right? If it's not team culture. Because how you do one thing is how you do everything. So here's an example. We have, every time we release a new feature for Visual Studio, we go through these go-to-market activities. We have to write documentation, we write the release notes. Inside Visual Studio, we have the what's new page. We have to write that stuff too. And then a blog post that goes along with it. So, and this is not even counting the spec work and all the other stuff, right? This is just kind of the go-to-market activities. Then we have to produce screenshots, animations, videos, and share it on social media. We have newsletters going out, and we have a bunch of internal communications as well. So this happens, all of this has to happen for every single feature that we do. Well, guess what? We don't do it all, always. Sometimes we don't do any of it, because it's kind of a tax, right? Because what do we need to do? Well, how good are everyone on the team at video editing? Or photo editing? Like, how do you take a great screenshot of Visual Studio, like a context menu? It's not obvious how to do that unless you learned. What about Git? If you're a product manager and you have to submit, let's say, release notes through Git, you'll be like, oh, do I fork or clone first? I haven't done this in months. I forget. And you ask someone, they'll be like, just read the wiki, and be like, Azure DevOps or GitHub, well, maybe you're better at one over the other. And to have marketing, I have to write in a marketing kind of way, and I have to understand how to communicate through that lens too. Like, this is not building features. This is kind of, separate from that. So a bunch of skills go in. So here's what we realized that, this was kind of a lot, and it was a lot of hours every month for every product manager on the team to go through all this, sometimes also the engineering team. So what if we asked everybody to just write one markdown file? One feature, one markdown file. Like just a short little, like maybe not even half a page in Word, but something like that. Those are the release notes. Put any screenshots you have in there. If you don't have screenshots, that's okay too, but you probably do. And then from that one Markdown file, we can produce, through automations, through AI, through all sorts of mechanisms, release notes, send it off to the video team for them to do that. We can create installer bulletins. So we have this thing when you install the updates, it will give you a little carousel of new features, things. It's something that we haven't rolled out to everybody yet, but that's coming off automatically. The What's New page in VS, newsletters, blog posts, internal sharing, social media. All of a sudden, we have a catalog of things for the social media accounts to produce. The docs team get a heads up much earlier in the process, so they will actually write the documentation so it's ready by the time we go GA, by the time of release, instead of months after. Before that, they often used our blog posts as the starting point for writing documentation. And that blog post could happen way later than the release, like months later. So by automating all this and having it up much earlier, we are able to do all this stuff. The UX review, it used to be that when you build a new feature, you could go to the UX board. We have like a group of people. I'm included in that, where you could come up and you could present your feature and get feedback on strings and does it look right, or do we have paradigms for how to do these type of features that we're not using? It's basically to make sure that it looks natural in Visual Studio, your feature. You had to request to come to the UX board. Now, the UX board are notified about your feature, and they will decide whether or not they think that you should come in, and they will pull you in instead. They will send you an invite. So we flipped the script. So now the PM only has to do that one Markdown file. That's all they do. Almost. But that's kind of almost all it is. And to make that work, we have what's called a quarterback. So it's not a full-time position. It's like maybe a 10, 20% position. It's like the editor-in-chief. Are all the feature release notes that come in, are they like in the same tone? Are they using the same language? That type of stuff. So there's an editorial aspect to this. So just have one person to do that. And AI is helping out with that quite significantly. But it does require that one person to kind of oversee that. And then, so that's me, I'm the quarterback. And because I cannot not write extensions for Visual Studio, of course, the entire authoring of the Markdown stuff is in a Visual Studio extension that gives you IntelliSense for everything, gives you a way to preview and generate the release notes all from within Visual Studio through an extension that we tell people to install. So instead of saying, go to the wiki, we say, install the extension. Okay, and that gives them all the tools. So they don't get any help, let's say, or descriptions on here, how you fill it in. You get IntelliSense. Right? We're doing it that way. You get validation. If you did something wrong, you get a squiggle that says, here's what is wrong and here's how to fix it. Again, we don't have to send people to a wiki that we know they're not going to read. And we produce absolutely fantastic content from this. So up in the left corner, you see the release notes. So this, I don't know of any other team that has ever spent as much time to build release notes as we have. So this was built with the community, and we iterated back and forth. What do you want in release notes? Okay, upload one version of that. Next round of feedback. And we did that in real time. Just hit the upload button, kind of like FTP upload, feedback, and this happened on Twitter, just back and forth. And there's like, okay, now we got it. Boom, done. That's it. And so that's just being auto-produced from that Visual Studio extension. And you see down in the bottom here, we got social media. We have all the assets. We have everything, descriptions, titles, assets to put in social media. And a really interesting thing was with that, once we started, this was all experimentation to begin with, right? And so we experimented. How do we reach the maximum number of people on social media? Do we do that through Visual Studio's account? Like Visual Studio has over 500,000 followers on Twitter. I think it's the same, if not more, on Facebook. There's LinkedIn, there's YouTube. So where do we get most engagement? It was not through Visual Studio's own accounts. It was through the people working on Visual Studio. In this case, when I tweet, I get more, and I have like 30,000. So way less than Visual Studio, but I get way many more comments. And as some person said, hey, people don't follow companies. People follow people. And in our case, that's definitely true. So that might be something that's interesting playing around with to see how can you double that or how can you increase your engagement, both in terms of likes, but also in comments. You want to hear if people don't like something or what did they like, so that you can take that into your next iteration of the feature, right? So Just an interesting tidbit there. It might be worth experimenting with. So what we do is that we have the individual person that's on social media, have them post it, and then we have an email that goes out to people with a lot of followers saying, hey, can you retweet that or can you repost that person, including the Visual Studio official accounts. So the goal is to bring everybody up to have even more followers so that we can have a better engagement with people. And it totally works. We get way more that way. And then on the right side, we see a blog post. So the blog post is generated through AI. The quarterback comes in, does the generation, maybe does a couple of versions of the generation, then looks through, does everything look right, changes a bunch of things potentially, and then hands it off to the team that did the feature and say, hey, this is now yours for review. So they go through, they make any modifications they need, and then they sign off on it, and we can post it, schedule it for the blog post, right? And so a super low effort blog post writing for the individual PMs. So the quarterback takes on that responsibility with heavy help from Copilot, Word Copilot in the office, and it scales fantastically that way. So we're ending up with a lot better content than what we had before. And as I said before, we didn't always make that content. So if you look at our release notes from like 2 years ago, they're like sometimes they have a lot of features in them, sometimes not so many, just because, well, did I have time for the release note? Did I remember to do the release notes? So on and so forth. But also like now they're actually written in the same tone, the same type of screenshots, so higher quality content, and the users are happy. Our internal users, they absolutely love this. It has helped them so much in their daily lives, their weekly. They can concentrate on building the product. Why are you on the Visual Studio team to begin with? It's because you want to make developers happy, right? They can concentrate on that, and then, the quarterback can do all that boring stuff. And at the end of the day, it's time less spent. Yes, the quarterback might spend more time on this, but overall, it's it's like hundreds of hours less spent per month by having all this in a very, very simple way. So this, of course, is as you can imagine, was received very, very well. And we've had many iterations over this to make it better over time, given the feedback that's come in and so forth. So we treated this exactly like we would an external feature. And we interviewed people and looked at their behaviors using the extension in Visual Studio and all these different things, just like we would externally, because the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. So the original question that we asked ourselves a few years ago, are we listening to users? I'd say absolutely yes, more than potentially ever before. Like the realization and the rethinking of what it is to put a smile on developers' face fundamentally changed the answer to all these to be a resounding yes, we are listening to users, yes, we do respect users, and yes, our goals are aligned. Might not be aligned from the up front, but when we spend time and we don't take the lazy route of, oh, let's just ship it to make the managers happy, but we take the time to align the circles, to align the goals, that's the way forward. That's the way that we've proven that that works so much better. So now I would say yes to all these questions, absolutely. And these were the 4 things that I wanted to share you about that we did. We did a bunch of other stuff too, but these were the big ones. So I hope that there's something here that is applicable to you as well when you come home. But at least now you know a little bit about how Visual Studio works. And with that, I want to open the floor for questions over here. Yes, sir?
I have a question.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I got a slide for the applause here. There we go.
I have a question about naming.
Yes.
Why is it called SSMS 21, and will it be a Visual Studio 25?
I think it's called SSMS 21 because it's the 21st version of SSMS. Just like the current version of Visual Studio 2022. What version is that? Anyone? 17. That's right. And so the next version of Visual Studio will be 18, right? Version number 18. How old is Visual Studio? How old is Visual Studio? No? 22, 28. It turned 28 this March. I think it's March 19, according to Wikipedia. So, yeah, but we'll have more information about upcoming new major versions at a later time. Yes?
The go-to-market tools that you were showing,
Yep.
Is that available to us in any way, or is it something you've thought of making available?
That's a great question. You know, I honestly have not thought of that. There is nothing. It's on GitHub. It's just private. I could flip the switch tomorrow. Is there anything proprietary in there, like IP protection? I don't think so. You know what's kind of cool about it is that instead of using Git, it uses SharePoint as its version history. So the way you set it up is that you go into a SharePoint site, you have a folder, you click a button that syncs it through your OneDrive.
Yeah.
So it syncs it down into your OneDrive for business folder. And then so now you have a name and a path. And so the extension does look in the OneDrive folder for that. And if it finds the layout there, it's fine. But that's a setting. You can set it to whatever. So what's really nice is that no one has to do pull requests, and you have version history through SharePoint. So there's no barrier of entry. So I needed to mention that because I thought that was very cool.
Okay.
You know what? Let me see what I can do.
Okay.
Because there's been some internal thing about other teams wanted to onboard to this. So I've done a little work in peeling out like the Visual Studio specifics into like a JSON file you put at the root of that folder that will instruct the extension to behave differently.
Okay.
So it's kind of, yeah.
That'd be cool.
Okay. Yeah.
The second thing was kind of a funny comment. I announced on our internal Slack at work, Visual Studio 2022 version 17.14 is available with GitHub Agent Mode, and the immediate response I got was, Visual Studio 2022, when are they going to change the number on that?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole reason why we have the year in there. Like there's some tradition to it, but yeah, it's unfortunate because it makes it sound like it's old, right? But literally, it was like updated a week ago. But it's like it sounds like it's 3 years old. It's unfortunate.
Visual Studio is running on a .NET framework. Is there any ambition to get to the newer version of .NET? And I understand it's a very complex product, very complex problem, but the performance improvements in the new .NET are pretty impressive. So I think that the benefit for Visual Studio would be quite interesting.
Yeah. So yes, Visual Studio is running on .NET Framework 4.8. No, we're not going to change it to .NET Core. We did some looking into that, and because of the way it's structured and all that, we're not going to get that much of benefit out of it. So the amount of work involved is like the return on investment is like in the negative.
Okay.
And so the concerns people have when it comes to like stuff like performance, let's say that was what you were mentioning, there are other ways that we're addressing that kind of aggressively at the moment. But I'll have more to share about that soon. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
There's kind of more developer tools than ever. Like, every week there's a new IDE coming out. Was that another driver for trying to make Visual Studio better for users?
Oh man, great question. Like, is competition driving innovation, right? Short answer, yes, absolutely it is. And I don't know if you saw the announcement, but we're now changing from being like this quarterly or every 3 to 4 months release cadence to be monthly. So 17.14, there will be no 17.15. Instead, there will be the June update, July update. So from now on, we're going to do monthly. And the reason is that the world is moving so fast that it's no longer satisfying for a bunch of our users to feel like, oh, well, VS Code just got agent mode. Why did VS not? Like, well, it did. I'm using it internally. We're just not releasing till like 2 months from now, right? So let's do that. Let's just release more often. So it was actually a big change to make that work. As you can imagine, Visual Studio is one of the largest apps in the world. Definitely the largest WPF app. No one really knows, but we think there's about 200 million lines of code in there. There is no way of finding out. Funny anecdote, the menu system in Visual Studio came from Office. They moved to Ribbon, the Office Ribbon, years ago. But we prefer the kind of the way it was. And so we never had the source code for that thing because it was an Office component. We just got the DLL. And Office, they don't really have that anymore either. So when we call them and say, hey, how many lines of code were there in that thing? They're going to be like, So we're like, okay, 50,000. No, I don't know. So no one really knows. So shipping that, we actually ship Visual Studio about 3 to 4 times a week. So when you consider that it's one of the largest apps in the world, that's a pretty lightweight release mechanism that allows you to do, or it seems lightweight, right? Make it seem lightweight, but it's not. It's a super tanker. It's a cruise liner, but we're able to ship it as if it was a dinghy, and that's fantastic. So a lot of stuff goes into that. A lot of smarts go into that, and so we had to tweak that to be able to do monthlies, because it changes the way we're looking at previews, relations to the stable releases and all that. So, but we're very excited about it because it means that we can now finally get all this stuff out, especially when it comes to AI, where the world just moves so fast. And the thing that held us back was not that we're not working on that stuff, it's our release schedule. So, yep.
My question is about Visual Studio Installer. Right now it's pretty convoluted. I think everyone agrees. So you have like workflows and then individual components for those workflows like .NET Desktop Development, Android, and whatever. And then there's separate components that are not related to those workflows. Oh. And I don't know how I do it, but I almost always install way too much Visual Studio than I actually need. Uh-huh. Are there any plans to overhaul the installer a bit or like make it easier to understand and navigate through?
We're always interested in updating and make that a better experience. Installing too much Visual Studio is usually, unless you have a disk space issue, is usually not something that impacts performance or anything else. Yeah. I'll give you an example. So let's say that you are a .NET developer and you accidentally clicked, or you had to, for some reason, you also took the C++ workload because whatever. That tool set is not being loaded by Visual Studio when you're working on .NET. The way Visual Studio loads components is such that it only, if those components are authored correctly, and for internal stuff, we do that correctly, they don't load. Like the same goes with the extensions. Most extensions, they don't activate till you push the button. That actually loads the extension the first time you push the button. Let's say you had a button that says insert GUID. I have an extension that does that. So let's take that as an example. That extension is not loaded into Visual Studio until you click the button that says insert GUID. So the first time you click it, it takes a little longer. It takes like 100 milliseconds longer. And then from that point on, it's loaded. So you don't really get a penalty for installing too much. What I think is more interested in, or what I'm very interested in, is making sure that if you don't have enough, let's say you want to just keep it bare bone, and then you clone a project that has a C++ project in it. I don't want that to show up as, hey, unsupported or unloaded because I don't have the features needed. What I want to make sure is that I have an acquisition story so you can say, oh, your Visual Studio will say, oh, you're missing this, click here to install it, and boom, and everything lights up. We have some of that today. It is by no means the, very comprehensive. So my thing is like making that even bigger, including when it comes to out of support stuff. I think that's the biggest kind of issue. Visual Studio, we ship things only that is supported. So I forget exactly what it is, but I don't think we ship .NET 7 anymore because it's out of support. .NET is on a 3 years support cycle. So we don't ship that. So if you open a .NET 7 project, we're like, we don't know what that is. It's like, but we do though, right? We built it. So even though it's out of support, can we get you that thing anyway since you have a dependency and for whatever reason, that's your choice to, So I'm very interested in that story. And so we're actually making great strides there. So I'd rather have you underinstall and then on-demand install, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
Also to elaborate, we do have what's called tailored install. So if you go through some installer online and you say, hey, I'm a web developer, or I'm a .NET developer, there is a quick way through the installer that doesn't show you to select individual components and all that. It's called a tailored install. So it's like, give me the Visual Studio for web install experience. And you click the link on the website, and it starts the installer with the web workload and the .NET, whatever is required for web, and that's it. So there are some easier ways to get started, but for power users, advanced users, and all that, we tend to, which all Visual Studios almost all advanced users, right? We have that bigger installer. Yeah.
What's happening with Visual Studio build tools?
What happens with build tools?
Yes, it's hard to find them.
It's hard to find them. They are still there, and they're still supported. They're not going away. If they're hard to find, then that's something I need to take back to the team if we don't have a clear link to where you can acquire those. They're absolutely still there and still supported. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, build tools a lot of people don't know that's another SKU we got. Yeah. All right. Any last questions? Going once? Going twice? All right. Thank you very much, everybody.